The wind howled across the desolate plains of New Mexico territory, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the promise of another merciless day. In the distance, a lone figure stumbled through the mesquite and prickly pear cactus, her tattered dress catching on the thorns of ocotillo plants. This was Sarah McKenna, 24 years old, and she had been walking for 3 days without food or water. Her husband's wagon train had abandoned her to die in this unforgiving wilderness, and every step she took seemed to bring her closer to her grave. But Sarah didn't know that, watching her from a ridge above, a man was making a decision that would change both their lives forever. Before we dive into this incredible tale of survival and unexpected salvation, I want to know where you're watching from today. Drop your country in the comments below and make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss tomorrow's story. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. It was the spring of 1878, and the American frontier was still a place where civilization ended at the edge of town, and the law of the land belonged to whoever was strong enough to enforce it. Sarah McKenna had married Thomas McKenna just 6 months earlier in Kansas City, full of hope and dreams of starting a new life in the Arizona territory, where Thomas had secured a claim for a small ranch. She was a schoolteacher's daughter from Missouri, educated and refined, but she possessed an inner strength that would soon be tested beyond anything she could have imagined. The wagon train that Thomas had organized consisted of 12 families, all heading west with the same dream of land and opportunity. Sarah had quickly become beloved among the women for her gentle nature and her ability to read and write, skills that were precious commodities on the frontier. She helped write letters for those who couldn't, read passages from the Bible during evening gatherings, and tended to the children when their mothers fell ill during the long journey. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning when Apache raiders struck just before dawn. The attack was swift and devastating. Thomas McKenna was among the first to fall, struck down while trying to defend the livestock. In the chaos that followed, with women screaming and children crying, Sarah found herself hiding beneath their wagon, clutching her husband's rifle with trembling hands. When the dust settled and the Apache had disappeared back into the desert with most of the horses and cattle, the surviving members of the wagon train faced a terrible decision. Of the original 12 families, only 8 remained, and they were stranded in hostile territory with limited supplies and no way to adequately defend themselves against another attack. It was then that the true nature of some of her traveling companions revealed itself. Marcus Hendricks, the unofficial leader of what remained of their group, gathered the survivors together. He was a hard man from Texas, with cold gray eyes and a reputation for doing whatever was necessary to survive. He had lost his own wife in the attack, but unlike Sarah, he still had his 2 grown sons and plenty of supplies. "We can't afford dead weight," Hendricks announced to the gathered survivors. "We've got wounded to care for, children to protect, and barely enough food to last us to the nearest settlement. Anyone who can't contribute to our survival is a liability we can't afford." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what he was suggesting. She was now a widow with no family, no wagon of her own, and nothing to offer except an extra mouth to feed. The other families looked away, unable to meet her eyes, but none spoke up in her defense. "Thomas left me some supplies," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I can contribute my share of food and water." Hendricks shook his head. "Thomas's supplies belong to the group now. We'll be dividing everything equally among the families. You're not a family anymore, Sarah. You're just one person, and we can't spare the resources." The cruelty of his words hit her like a physical blow. These people had been her friends, her companions on the long journey west. She had shared meals with them, cared for their children, and mourned their losses as if they were her own family. Now they were prepared to abandon her to die in the wilderness without a second thought. "Please," she whispered, "I can walk. I won't slow you down. I'll take only the smallest portion of food and water. I'll do whatever work needs to be done." But Hendricks had already made up his mind, and the others were too frightened and desperate to oppose him. They feared that showing mercy to Sarah might mean death for their own families, and in their terror, they chose the path of cold calculation. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the surviving members of the wagon train prepared to continue their journey west. They left Sarah with nothing but the clothes on her back, a single canteen of water, and a small bundle of hardtack biscuits that one of the women had secretly pressed into her hands when Hendricks wasn't looking. "I'm sorry, Sarah," the woman whispered. "God forgive us all." And then they were gone, leaving Sarah alone in the vast expanse of the Chihuahuan Desert, with nothing but the endless sky above and the thorny landscape stretching to the horizon in every direction. For the first day, Sarah walked west, following the faint tracks of the wagon train, hoping that the others might change their minds and come back for her. But as the hours passed and the tracks grew fainter in the shifting sand, she realized that she was truly on her own. The desert was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day, forcing her to seek shelter beneath the sparse shade of creosote bushes and barrel cacti. The nights were surprisingly cold, and she shivered in her thin dress, unable to build a fire for fear of attracting unwanted attention from Apache raiders or wild animals. By the second day, her water was gone, and the hardtack biscuits had crumbled to dust in her pack. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her tongue swollen with thirst, and her skin was burned red from the relentless sun. She had learned to recognize the shapes of turkey vultures circling overhead, and she knew they were following her, waiting for her to fall. The landscape around her was both beautiful and deadly. Towering saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels in the distance, their arms raised to the sky in a gesture that seemed almost human. Palo verde trees provided occasional patches of shade with their yellow-green bark and tiny leaves, while ghost-pale desert willows grew in dry washes that might see water once or twice a year. The ground was carpeted with purple-flowered lupines and bright orange Indian paintbrush, creating a tapestry of color that mocked the desperation of her situation. It was on the third day, as Sarah stumbled through a grove of smoke trees near a dry creek bed, that she first saw him. At first, she thought he was a mirage, a product of her sun-addled brain and desperate thirst. A tall figure sat motionless on horseback atop a rocky outcrop, watching her with the patience of a hunting hawk. Sarah blinked hard, trying to clear her vision, and when she looked again, the figure was still there. As her eyes focused, she could make out more details. The man was dressed in a mixture of frontier clothing and Apache garb, leather pants, a cotton shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. His horse was a sturdy paint mare, well suited to the harsh desert environment. Fear shot through Sarah's exhausted body. Was this one of the Apache raiders who had attacked their wagon train? Had he been following her, waiting for the right moment to finish what his companions had started? She looked around desperately for some place to hide, but the desert offered little cover, and she was too weak to run. The man seemed to sense her terror, because he slowly dismounted and began walking toward her, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. As he drew closer, Sarah could see that he was not Apache at all, but a white man, though his skin was deeply tanned from years under the desert sun. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything about her situation in a single glance. "Easy there, miss," he said in a gentle voice. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Daniel Hawthorne, and it looks like you could use some help." Sarah wanted to respond, but her throat was so dry that only a croak emerged. Daniel immediately unslung a water skin from his shoulder and offered it to her. "Drink slowly," he advised. "I can see you've been out here for a while." The water was warm and tasted slightly of leather, but to Sarah it was the most wonderful thing she had ever experienced. She forced herself to take small sips, even though every instinct screamed at her to drink deeply. "Thank you," she managed to whisper after a few moments. Daniel studied her carefully, taking in her sunburned skin, her torn dress, and the obvious signs of dehydration and starvation. "How long have you been walking?" "3 days," Sarah replied. "Maybe 4. I've lost track. Where are you trying to get to?" Sarah gestured vaguely toward the west. "There was a wagon train. They left me behind." Daniel's expression darkened. "They left you here? Alone? In Apache country?" The shame of it washed over Sarah again, and she felt tears threatening to spill from her already dry eyes. "My husband was killed in a raid. The others said they couldn't afford to keep me, that I was dead weight." For a long moment Daniel said nothing, but Sarah could see anger flickering in his eyes. Not anger directed at her, but at the people who had abandoned her to die in the wilderness. "Well, they were wrong," he said finally. "Dead wrong. Can you travel, if I help you up onto my horse?" Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Daniel helped her to her feet, and she was shocked by how gentle his touch was, how carefully he supported her weight as they walked to where his paint mare waited patiently. "This is Sage," Daniel said, patting the horse's neck. "She's carried me through worse situations than this, so don't worry about her being able to handle both of us." As Daniel helped her up into the saddle, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and confusion. Who was this man who had appeared out of nowhere like an angel of mercy? Why was he helping her, when her own traveling companions had been so quick to cast her aside? "Where are we going?" she asked as Daniel swung up behind her. "My place," he replied. "It's not much, but it's safe, and you need food and medical attention." As they rode across the desert, Daniel told her about himself. He had been a cavalry scout for the army until 2 years ago, when he had grown tired of the endless cycle of conflict between the settlers and the Apache. He had purchased a small piece of land near a reliable water source and built a modest homestead where he raised horses and occasionally guided travelers through the dangerous territory. "I know this country better than most," he explained. "The Apache mostly leave me alone because I respect their ways and don't try to take more than I need. I've even traded with them on occasion." Sarah was amazed by this revelation. Everything she had been told about the Apache painted them as savage killers who showed no mercy to any white person they encountered. The idea that someone could live peacefully alongside them seemed almost impossible. "Aren't you afraid they'll turn on you?" she asked. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Fear is a luxury I can't afford out here. I treat them with respect, and they return the favor. It's not always easy, and there have been some tense moments, but I've found that most people, regardless of their background, respond well to honesty and fairness." After what felt like hours of riding, they crested a small hill, and Sarah saw Daniel's homestead spread out below them. It was indeed modest, consisting of a single-story adobe house, a stable, a corral with several horses, and a small garden protected by a fence made of ocotillo branches. The thing that struck Sarah most forcefully was how neat and well-maintained everything appeared. The house was freshly whitewashed, the stable was in good repair, and the garden showed signs of careful tending. This was not the rough, temporary shelter of a drifter or an outlaw, but the home of a man who intended to stay and build something permanent. Daniel helped her down from Sage and led her toward the house. "I'm afraid it's not much like what you're probably used to," he said apologetically. Sarah almost laughed. After 3 days in the desert with nothing but the sky for a roof, his simple adobe home looked like a palace to her. The interior was sparse but comfortable. There was a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and what appeared to be a bedroom beyond a doorway covered by a colorful blanket. The walls were thick adobe that would keep the interior cool during the day and warm at night, and the floor was made of smooth-packed earth covered with several Native American rugs. "You can have the bedroom," Daniel said. "I'll sleep out here on the floor. First, though, let's get some food into you and take a look at those burns." Over the next hour, Daniel proved to be as capable a caretaker as he was a rescuer. He prepared a simple but nourishing meal of beans, cornbread, and dried meat, insisting that Sarah eat slowly to avoid making herself sick. He also mixed up a salve from plants he kept dried in his kitchen and gently applied it to her sunburned skin. "Aloe and sage," he explained. "The Apache taught me about desert medicine. It'll help heal the burns and prevent infection." As the sun began to set, painting the desert landscape in shades of orange and purple, Sarah felt truly safe for the first time since the Apache attack. She was clean, fed, and protected, but more than that, she was in the company of a man who had shown her more kindness in a few hours than her traveling companions had managed in months of shared hardship. "Daniel," she said as he prepared to spread his bedroll near the fireplace, "why did you help me? You don't know anything about me. I could be a criminal or a lunatic for all you know." Daniel smiled, and Sarah noticed how it transformed his weathered features. "I suppose you could be. But I've learned to trust my instincts about people, and my instincts tell me you're a good woman who got dealt a bad hand. Besides, leaving you to die out there wouldn't have been right, no matter who you were." That night, Sarah lay in Daniel's bed, staring up at the wooden beams of the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the desert night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and she could hear the gentle nickering of horses in the corral. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to think about the future, rather than simply surviving from one moment to the next. Over the following days, Sarah slowly regained her strength. Daniel proved to be a thoughtful and considerate host, giving her space when she needed it, but always available to talk when she felt ready. He showed her around his small ranch, explaining how he had diverted water from a nearby spring to irrigate his garden and water his horses. "Water is life out here," he told her. "Control the water and you can survive. Waste it and you'll die." Sarah was impressed by his ingenuity and resourcefulness. He had built everything himself, from the house to the irrigation system, and he maintained it all with the pride of a man who knew the value of hard work. She found herself wondering what her life might have been like if she had married a man like Daniel instead of Thomas. Thomas had been a dreamer, full of grand plans and big ideas, but lacking the practical knowledge to make them reality. He had convinced her that they would build a cattle empire in Arizona, but he had never bothered to learn the basics of ranching or to study the challenges of frontier life. In contrast, Daniel seemed to understand the desert and its demands with an almost intuitive wisdom. As the days passed, Sarah began to make herself useful around the homestead. She took over the cooking, mended Daniel's clothes, and helped tend the garden. She discovered that she had a natural talent for working with the horses, and Daniel began teaching her about training and handling the animals. "You have gentle hands," he observed one afternoon as she brushed down sage. "The horses trust you." Sarah felt a warmth at his praise that surprised her. It had been so long since anyone had noticed her contributions or valued her skills. Thomas had loved her, but he had always seen her as something to be protected and cared for, not as a partner who could contribute to their shared success. It was during her second week at the ranch that Sarah encountered her first Apache visitors. She was working in the garden when she heard Daniel call out a greeting in what sounded like a foreign language. Looking up, She saw 3 Apache men approaching on horseback. Sarah's first instinct was to run, but Daniel's calm demeanor reassured her. He walked forward to meet the visitors, speaking to them in their own language with the fluency of long practice. After a brief conversation, he returned to where Sarah stood frozen by the tomato plants. "They're traders," he explained. "They come by every few weeks to exchange goods. They were curious about you, but I told them you were my guest and under my protection." The Apache men were not the savage killers that Sarah had imagined. They were simply men, with families and concerns much like anyone else. The eldest, who seemed to be their leader, had intelligent eyes and spoke a few words of English. When Daniel introduced Sarah, the man nodded politely and said something that made Daniel smile. "What did he say?" Sarah asked after the visitors had departed. "He said you have the eyes of someone who has seen great sorrow but has not let it destroy her spirit. He considers that a sign of strength." Sarah was moved by this unexpected wisdom from someone she had been taught to fear. It made her realize how much of what she had believed about frontier life was based on stories and prejudices rather than actual experience. As summer progressed, Sarah found herself settling into a rhythm of life that felt more natural and fulfilling than anything she had experienced before. She and Daniel worked together as partners, each contributing their skills to the success of the ranch. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the desert sunset while discussing everything from literature to philosophy to plans for expanding their small horse herd. Sarah discovered that Daniel was far better educated than his rough appearance might suggest. He had attended college in the East before coming west, and he owned a small but well-chosen collection of books that they often read aloud to each other in the evenings. "I never expected to find such an oasis of civilization out here," Sarah admitted one night. "Civilization isn't about cities and fancy buildings," Daniel replied. "It's about treating others with respect, pursuing knowledge, and trying to build something better for the next generation." It was sometime during her 3rd month at the ranch that Sarah realized she had fallen in love with Daniel Hawthorne. The realization came not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual awareness that her feelings had been growing deeper with each passing day. She loved his quiet strength, his gentle humor, and his deep respect for the land and its people. Most of all, she loved the way he saw her as a complete person, capable and valuable in her own right. The question was whether he felt the same way about her. Daniel was unfailingly kind and respectful, but he had never given any indication that he saw her as more than a guest who had extended her stay. Sarah began to worry that she was imposing on his hospitality and that he was too polite to ask her to leave. Her fears were put to rest one evening in late September. They had been working together to repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm, and as they walked back to the house, Daniel suddenly stopped and turned to face her. "Sarah," he said, his voice unusually serious, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." Sarah's heart began to race. "Of course. Are you happy here? I mean, truly happy, or are you just making the best of a difficult situation?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She had expected him to ask her to leave, not to inquire about her happiness. "I'm happier than I've ever been in my life," she replied truthfully. "Why do you ask?" Daniel looked down at the ground, suddenly seeming almost shy. "Because I've been thinking about asking you to stay permanently, not as a guest, but as my partner, my wife, if you'll have me." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. "Daniel, I know it's presumptuous," he continued quickly. "I know you might not feel the same way about me, and I know you've already been through the loss of one husband. I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to return to civilization and try to rebuild your life there. But I had to ask, because the thought of you leaving has become unbearable." Sarah stepped closer to him, reaching up to touch his face with her hand. Daniel Hawthorne, I have been hoping you would ask me that question for weeks now. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll stay here and build a life with you. Yes, to everything. The relief and joy that flooded Daniel's features was worth all the hardship Sarah had endured to reach this moment. When he kissed her, it was with a passion and tenderness that made her feel truly alive for the first time since Thomas's death. They were married the following month by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through the territory. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful, conducted on the porch of their adobe home with the vast desert stretching away in all directions. The Apache trader who had become Daniel's friend attended the ceremony, offering a blessing in his own language that seemed to sanctify their union in the eyes of the land itself. As Sarah stood beside Daniel, speaking her vows with the wind carrying the scent of sage and creosote across the desert, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been abandoned by people she trusted, left to die in a hostile wilderness, and had survived through a combination of her own determination and the unexpected kindness of a stranger. But perhaps it hadn't been mere chance that had led Daniel to find her on that desperate third day. Perhaps it had been fate, or providence, or simply the desert's way of rewarding those who refuse to give up hope, even in the darkest circumstances. Winter came early that year, bringing with it challenges that tested the strength of their new marriage. A severe drought forced them to carefully ration their water, and a pack of wolves began threatening their horses. But Sarah and Daniel faced each difficulty together, their partnership growing stronger with every obstacle they overcame. In the spring, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a mixture of joy and terror as she remembered the dangers of childbirth on the frontier. But Daniel's steady presence and the network of friends they had built among both settlers and Apache gave her confidence that their child would be born into a world of love and support. Their daughter was born on a warm May morning, with the assistance of an Apache woman who had become Sarah's friend and mentor in desert medicine. As Sarah held her newborn child and looked into Daniel's tear-filled eyes, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the strange and winding path that had led her to this perfect moment. They named the baby Hope because she represented everything they had dared to dream of during those long months of building their life together. And as Sarah watched Daniel cradle their daughter with infinite gentleness, she knew that she had found something infinitely more valuable than the cattle ranch and comfortable life she had originally set out to build in Arizona. She had found home. Years passed, and the small ranch prospered. Daniel's reputation as a horse trainer spread throughout the territory, and they were able to expand their operation. Sarah became known for her skill as a healer, combining the medical knowledge she had learned from her schoolteacher mother with the desert wisdom taught to her by Apache friends. Hope grew into a bright, curious child who spoke both English and Apache fluently and seemed as comfortable in the saddle as on her own feet. She would often sit with her parents on the porch in the evenings, listening to the stories of how they had found each other in the vast wilderness and built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. On quiet nights, when the desert wind carried the scent of blooming Palo Verde trees and the sound of coyotes singing in the distance, Sarah would sometimes think about the wagon train that had abandoned her so many years ago. She wondered if they had ever made it to their intended destination, if they had found the prosperity and security they had been seeking. But those thoughts no longer carried any bitterness or regret. The people who had left her to die had given her the greatest gift imaginable, though they had never intended to. They had forced her onto a path that led to Daniel, to this life, to the deep contentment that filled her days and her dreams. As she looked out across the land that she and Daniel had tamed and cultivated, watching their horses graze in the moonlight and listening to their daughter's peaceful breathing from the next room, Sarah knew that she was exactly where she belonged. The desert had tested her, nearly broken her, but ultimately it had revealed her true strength and led her to her true home. In the end, sometimes the worst thing that can happen to us becomes the door to the best thing that ever will. If you enjoyed Sarah and Daniel's incredible story of survival, love, and finding hope in the most unlikely circumstances, make sure to hit that subscribe button below. Tomorrow, I'll be sharing another amazing tale from the frontier, and you won't want to miss it.